Hi there, this is the second video I've made on Nietzsche for you. We just talked about Nietzsche's view of the death of God, which for Nietzsche is not really the death of the being God, but the death of meaning or truth or truth to be discovered. For Nietzsche, then, we can't get out of the cave. But the interesting thing is that it looks like since Nietzsche believes that there is no such thing as truth, why does he consider the death of God a tragedy? That's what we left the last video on. And this is going to try to give an answer by looking at what Nietzsche calls something called the will to truth. Okay, and when in this video, I'm trying to set up the story that Nietzsche tries to tell here from Nietzsche's point of view. It's a little complicated. It's not in the order that is presented in On Being and Beyond Good and Evil, which is more presented kind of aphoristically, meant to sort of throw the ideas out and put them together. So, but what I plan to do is quote passages from Nietzsche, so to support my points, to fill in my points, to explain my points, to let you see what's going on in there. I imagine that you'll be looking at those points and reading them with me and thinking about them and hopefully wondering, did I get it right? Or would you look at that a different way? Because you're certainly free to make up your own mind about what you think Nietzsche is meaning. Nietzsche talks a lot about truth, especially in the preface in part 1. He starts the whole book off with "Suppose truth is a woman," which is a quote to talk about another time. In part 1, very first aphorism of the book, after the preface, he asks the question about the value of truth. Why is truth better than untruth? So a little bit of the way through that first paragraph, he says, what really is this will to truth in us? In fact, we made a long halt at the question as to the origin of this will, until at last we came to an absolute standstill before a yet more fundamental question. We inquired about the value of this will. So what good is it? Why do we want it? Granted that we want the truth, why not rather untruth and uncertainty, even ignorance? So Nietzsche is calling into question what would be the point of knowing the truth? And is there a point to having an untruth? And part of the reason why I think he's raising that is because he wants to tell us that there is some goals to untruth, at least in some way of understanding it. So if you skip ahead to 4, you find that the 4 starts out like this. The falseness of an opinion is not for us any objection to it. That's an interesting line. Just because it's false, us, me, Nietzsche, I don't object to that. It is here perhaps that our new language sounds most strangely. The question is how far an opinion is life-furthering, life-preserving, species-preserving, perhaps species-rearing, and we are fundamentally inclined to maintain that the falsest opinions are the most indispensable to us, that without a recognition of logical fictions, without a comparison of reality with the purely imagined world of the absolute and immutable, without a constant counterfeiting of the world by means of numbers, man could not live. That the renunciation of false opinions would be a renunciation of life, a negation of life. So notice that. Man could not live without fictions, he said. We'll follow up and try to explain this, what he might be thinking. And renunciation of false opinions, he says, is a renunciation of life. Okay, so fictions are necessary to life. Fictions can produce good consequences. Fictions can produce life-furthering, life-preserving, and species-preserving results. Okay, now what does he mean by that? Well, you go back to the preface, and we find this. The philosophy of the dogmatists, and dogmatists are people who believe in truth, it is to be hoped, was only a promise for thousands of years afterwards, as was astrology. Hope you know what astrology is. In still earlier times, in the service of which probably more labor, gold, acuteness, and patience have been spent than on any actual science hitherto. So yeah, Nietzsche doesn't believe in astrology no more than us. It's not an actual science. We owe to it and to its superterrestrial pretensions in Asia and Egypt the grand style of architecture. So astrology, which was a fiction, produced great things, a grand style of architecture. I'm reminded probably of the pyramids. Is that what you're thinking about? Um, some fictions can even be awe-inspiring. Again, in the preface, it seems that in order to inscribe themselves upon the heart of humanity with everlasting claims, all great things have first to wander about the world as enormous and awe-inspiring caricatures. Dogmatic philosophy, again, that's philosophy that believes in truth, has been a caricature of this kind. For instance, the Vedanta doctrine in Asia and Platonism in Europe. This is our first mention of Platonism. He talks about Platonism several times in part 1 and in the preface. So he's saying that it's necessary to human life that great things come from great fictions. For example, and this is an example he gives later on, Christianity produced great art, great churches, great works of literature. Platonism and the fiction of objective truth, which he just calls it dogmatic philosophy, produced modern science, medicine, technology. These are all great things. So truth and fiction have instrumental values, he says. Truth and untruth have a value. They both have their place. It raises the question whether there really is an intrinsic value to truth. I don't think Nietzsche thinks there is. The value of truth is what it does. The value of untruth is what it does too. But that opens it up to causing harm as well as good. So that brings us to what's going on in modern life. Okay, so philosophers, these are the philosophers that Nietzsche's most thinking about, the philosophy of philosophers of the last couple hundred years, people in the wake of Descartes, have emptied out life. They've ended up calling these fictions untrue, partly because they've got to, because that's what philosophers do. So here's a quote: "The will to truth, which is to tempt us to many hazardous enterprise," and this is the very beginning of the book, the first line, "the famous truthfulness of which all philosophers have hitherto spoken with respect." Philosophers are trying to figure out the truth, or so that's the story. "What questions has this will to truth not laid before us? What strange, perplexing, questionable questions! It is already a long story, yet it seems as if it were hardly commenced. Is it any wonder if we at last grow distrustful, lose patience, and turn impatiently away?" So we've got to the point where the will to untruth, the opposite of the will to truth, and they come together, I think. If you have a will to truth, if you're trying to find the truth, then you have a will to get rid of the untruths. And now we're saying, at least at Nietzsche's time, there is no God, there is no truth. But understood in Nietzsche's story, this isn't a philosophical program. It's a kind of unmasking, saying the emperor has no clothes, if you remember that story, revealing to the world that our fictions are really fictions. And this ends up making life worse. It empties out life. Okay, we can't follow something if we know that it's not true. And the philosophers are the ones to blame. So now we'll have 3 quotes in a row talking about what philosophers do. So the first one comes from the second paragraph, second aphorism. "This mode of reasoning discloses the typical prejudice by which metaphysicians of all times," and he's saying this in response to an objection that opposites can't come from opposites. So meaning, lack of meaning can't come from meaning. The more you pursue meaning, would be the objection, the more meaningful life becomes. And he says, not so. This mode of evaluation is at the back of all their logical procedure. Through this belief of theirs, they exert themselves for their knowledge. Notice the quotes. "For something that is in the end solemnly Christian, the truth. The fundamental belief of metaphysicians is the belief in the antithesis of values." Going on, so we'll jump to 3. "Having kept a sharp eye on philosophers and having read between their lines long enough." Imagine that. So watching Nietzsche reading philosophers and saying, what are they really up to? This is a lot like James. That there's psychology here rather than metaphysics. "I now say to myself that the greater part of conscious thinking must be counted among the instinctive functions. And it is so even in the case of philosophical thinking." So philosophical thinking is not a choice. It's not an attempt to find the truth. It's an instinctive function. One has little here to learn anew, as one learned anew about heredity and innateness. So there's nothing new. It's simply the philosopher expressing something instinctively. As little as the act of birth comes into consideration in the whole process, just as little is being conscious opposed to the instinctive in any decisive sense. The greater part of the conscious thinking of a philosopher is secretly influenced by his instincts. If we need to follow it very quickly on number 6, it has gradually become clear to me what every great philosophy up to now has consisted of: the confession of its originator, and a species of involuntary and unconscious autobiography. All philosophy is rooted in psychology. James said the same thing. And the worst of these psychologizers, we might say, in Nietzsche's mind, is Plato, the worst and the great. So he's not a one or the other. Okay, Plato is the greatest and the worst in Nietzsche. That's what he was. He won't just say, I like Plato, I dislike Plato. I dislike Plato, but I stand in awe of Plato. And so let us not be ungrateful, he says in the preface, although it must certainly be confessed that the worst, the most tiresome, and the most dangerous of errors hitherto has been a dogmatist error, namely Plato's invention of pure spirit and the good in itself. Notice that Platonic philosophy for him is a form of nihilism. Now, he's accused of being a nihilist, but Platonic philosophy is nihilism because it believes in nothing, because the good, the pure spirit, doesn't exist. So that's, for Nietzsche, true nihilism. Christianity is also a form of nihilism. Again, belief in God. If there's no God, you're believing in nothing. So what Nietzsche is saying then is that life is about creating great fictions that produce good consequences. Consequences that are life-preserving, life-affirming. Things like great architecture, art, works of literature. So let's be specific. Let's keep not the love of the abstract. Nietzsche can be very abstract sometimes. Philosophy is no different. It is a fiction that makes life bearable. It is one of the greatest, according to Nietzsche, and so one of the worst. Christianity is another. Both are actually nihilisms, since they put ultimate value in the good or God, which aren't real. But philosophy also comes with a will to truth. Back to our first point, a force that identifies and prizes truth, which, remember, is a fiction, which produces, too, a will to untruth. As modern philosophy rejected things like God, the good, objective truth, as untrue, it ended up unmasking itself. It didn't seem to realize that it was a big form of untruth, a fiction to begin with, forcing the world to reject not only its creating fiction, but also the means by which they made life bearable. So let's see if we can put this together in maybe a little bit of a schematic. So the problem for modern life, according to Nietzsche, fictions are necessary for life. Philosophy is part of that process of creating fictions. But philosophy also develops a will to truth and begins to value truth over untruth and look for things that are true and reject things that are untrue. So it proves that our fictions are fictions in Nietzsche's mind, that the good and God. So the crisis that this creates is there's no great untruths to make life bearable anymore. So what are we going to do? Well, for Nietzsche, there's really two responses. And we'll talk more about this in the next video about why they're responses and what kind of responses they are. One response is that we will eventually become the last man. And this is a human who is no longer a human who's an animal. Because in Nietzsche's mind, humanity is to live by fictions, to have meaning. They don't have any meaning. Or the other response is the overman. This is called the free spirit in this book, who is described as a new kind of philosopher who will create new meaning, a new Plato maybe. Philosophers of the dangerous, perhaps, in the sense of the term, in every sense of the term. That's how he's quoted at the last piece of 2. In other words, the free spirit. Okay, so let's stop there. We'll come back and we'll talk a little more focused on the philosopher in Nietzsche's mind and what the philosophers do.